Hi. It occurred to me only today, January 1st, 2026, that I wanted to make a video of learnings around AI that I took away from 2025. And these aren't learnings of techniques or how to, the science or engineering per se of how to build AI. It's more of learnings about the use of AI in business and about the business models around AI. And just like I came up with six surprising learnings for AI from 2025 that um, where I think were also kind of surprising to me at the time in some way or another. The first of these, I think, is just the biggest AI news story of 2025, and it's vibe coding. And the learning would be the easiest way to make successful business impact with AI is to have it go write software. And um, I think this is going to have markedly disruptive impacts on businesses, probably starting to culminate at some point in 2026. Although I didn't include this in my 2026 predictions video. Maybe it's just because it's kind of too obvious, or I don't know. But in any case, I think it's going to have markedly disruptive impacts to businesses in 2026 and then into the foreseeable future. I think it changes. I think it changes the game considerably, and part of the part of the reason that I think that is, um, I kind of reflect on we've had this very powerful LLM based AI for like 3 years now, and businesses don't always seem to know what to do with it. It's certainly changing things. It's certainly transforming things. But at the same time, you ask a lot of business leaders, and they don't know how to use AI. They don't know how they can use AI, or they're not seeing the ROI they might have expected. That's a easy story to see, and yet it feels like a game that everybody has to play. Um, and I think the change in the equation of AI predominantly writing software could be this big missing piece that starts to unlock um, the economic equation for successful AI adoption. And why I think that makes sense to me is that I think that businesses that have been dabbling in AI have they don't necessarily have the criteria to validate to a degree of confidence whether an AI implementation is successful for production. And I think it stops a lot of projects around AI pretty quickly. Where I think that's going to change with the development of software is that the same businesses that don't have the muscle to necessarily validate AI do have the knowledge and wherewithal to validate software. And um, so I think that's going to change the equation for successful AI adoption in established businesses. But I think at the same time, um, new businesses, startups, etc., can now, without having to scale up in terms of human headcount, can build software very, very, very rapidly. And at a certain point, I think in the near term, I think that point is when the software, I think like we're going to cross the Rubicon when software can basically, we're comfortable on some level with software independently pushing to main branches independently without human supervision. I don't think we're there yet because I'm not there yet because I don't let AIs push to main without supervision. But it's not implausible that we get there somewhere in 2026. Um, I think once we get to that point and we can switch from trying to validate AI to trying to validate software, we unlock a dimension of scale that will really allow these startup businesses that are just going to go and directly compete with incumbents in various fields. E-commerce, as I talk about in the predictions video, is a kind of obvious one. Um, to go directly compete, and I think those startup businesses, I think the writing would be on the wall for the incumbent businesses that are targetable like that. They, I think um, I think before AIs were able to write software, or we thought of them as being able to write software. You talk about automation and AI, and I say all the following with um, all respect for the people who are going to have their livelihoods impacted by all of this, and I don't mean to make light of it at all. But if you have a business with 5,000 people that delivers a good, and then um, suddenly you can have a business that has much smaller headcount deliver the same good, I think that um, it's not a promising picture for the incumbents at that point. I do think that the missing degree between fully human staffed business and fully automated business is the ability to have AI write software. Because I think that there's been a little bit of a lurking bad analogy for AI based automation that we're going to take that company of humans or that team of humans or that organization of humans, and we're going to kind of replace them one to one with AIs. And I think that that's not the right metaphor. I think that we're not going to, a 5,000 person business isn't going to be replaced by 5,000 AIs, even if that, that's a straw man a little bit. I'm kind of making it absurd on purpose, but a version of it is a little bit more charitable, and I still think is false, which is, let's say that we have that 5,000 person business, and that 5,000 person business let's say that there are 100 distinct roles in that business. There's 100 distinct job roles in that business. I still don't think that you're replacing it with 100 different AI agents, one for each of those job roles. I don't think that that's the way this is going to work. Why? Um, I think because I doubt the ability of the incumbents to disrupt themselves in that way, but also I tend to believe that what is more likely to happen is the startup that will go after the same business model will have fewer of the incumbents' challenges, including their own inner organizational challenges, and they'll build up what they need to go solve the problem and deliver the product that they deliver. And they will not necessarily replicate each and every process and step that those incumbent businesses have. Um, I mean, to be flip, if you have a fully automated business, you don't need human HR for your fully automated business. But that's like one out of 50 examples I could point to. So suffice it to say, I think that like the development of AI writing software is going to shift towards massively automated, smaller businesses that compete for the same markets as the incumbent businesses and maybe compete for new markets and maybe destroy some old ones, um, but won't necessarily have the same shape or any particular analogy to the incumbent businesses. And I think that's just the way that business disruption is. Um, a kind of sub impact of all of this, which I think maybe matters more to me and other AI nerds and matters less to the larger community around AI, is I've never set entirely easy with the way certain kinds of grounding are done within AI. Like we've increasingly looked for ways to insert more grounding into AI to make them more reliable and dependable. And a lot of that grounding tends to be factual. So we give LLMs the ability to um, go look up things. and RAG is an example of that. And then there are many successor technologies to RAG that allow LLMs to I should say AIs based on LLMs to go look up things on demand that they quote don't know. And I think that's one kind of grounding. You can kind of ground facts, and like if you're more dependable, if you have more dependable facts at your disposal, you're probably more likely to produce more correct answers. But another kind of grounding is grounding of reasoning itself. By the way, as an aside, I don't always like using the word reasoning for reasoning LLMs. Not necessarily because it's a kind of cognition that I think they have or don't have. I just don't think it's a particularly scientifically founded term, nor matches what humans do as reasoning per se. That's all an aside. Um, but I think the possibility of grounding LLM reasoning is kind of tantalizing, because if an LLM writes programs on demand to give answers to humans, um, those programs can kind of help to edify its reasoning. And to give you kind of a contrived example of what I'm thinking here, I'll give you two contrived examples of what I'm thinking here. The first of those is, say I ask state of the art AI LLM, ChatGPT 5.2, Gemini 3, etc., Anthropic 4.5, Opus. I ask it a relatively complex economics question. Maybe I ask it to maybe I ask to forecast United States GDP for 2026, something like that. Um, if it goes and looks up all the relevant inputs and facts, but kind of has like a heuristic or kind of hand wavy answer, I'm not like super likely to rely on the answer. And it's not because it's an AI. It's just like if a human did that, I don't know that I would be super likely to rely on it. But if it goes and runs a simulation, writes a program, runs a simulation, and shows a forecast based on that simulation, goes and builds a hierarchical Bayesian model to evidence its reasoning, I'm going to give that more credence than I would give the kind of heuristic argument. The other analogy I would make is kind of like proof systems. I think that if and maybe they do this to some point right now, I haven't seen evidence of it, but if LLMs could be induced to um, write proofs to back statements that are articulable as proofs, I think that that's a very interesting dimension for grounding reasoning in LLMs. And proof systems and LLMs are obviously a big line of research, but usually more in the what can you do to extend proof systems line of research. I'm kind of interested here a little bit more in the how can you use it to backstop LLMs with the proof system. I think that's kind of interesting. But yeah, I think like the learning, the first learning, which I think is going to have profound continued impact across business with respect to AI, is this new world in which AIs write software. The second learning for AI from 2025, and this is going to get me roasted on the internet. This is going to get me roasted from multiple communities on the internet because it offends multiple communities on the internet. Software development communities, not other kinds of communities, is that the bitter lesson led OpenAI to misfocus. The bitter lesson, as I think we know from Rich Sutton, is basically the statement that approaches which leverage scale of compute, which can also include scale of data, tend to outperform in the long term systems that try to bake in domain knowledge. And OpenAI, I think, is appropriately like better lesson to build and like um, tries to figure out ways to apply scale of compute to problems. And they were looking at the fact that they were probably like running up on a practical data limit for pre-training, and they were looking for a different compute paradigm to be able to keep propelling their models. And some of this takes place before 2025, but 2025 kind of culminated in, or the effort culminated in 2025 into scaling inference time reasoning. It's kind of like in full swing by autumn of 2024. I think materialized fully in 2025. Um, OpenAI invested in the kind of scaling inference time reasoning mode. This is the mode if you've interfaced with ChatGPT, where it tries to determine like about how complex your problem might be, and will dynamically scale to the number of reasoning tokens that it thinks that you need for your problem, so that a hard problem requires more reasoning tokens than a not hard problem. Um, the but why I say misfocus is that it didn't really provide them any useful moat, and in some ways, while they were working and doing that, Anthropic kind of took away their leadership position, technical leadership position on B2B AI, investing in Claude Code, investing in that market around AI based coding, probably faster than OpenAI did. If I'm remembering correctly, OpenAI had the CLI codex, I think, before Claude Code really hit the scene, if I'm not mistaken. But maybe Claude Code had, I think Claude Code definitely had more momentum than that first OpenAI CLI codex. They have multiple products called codex, but I digress. Um, Claude Code really kind of found some purchase, and then OpenAI kind of came after it with the kind of GitHub oriented product that they also call Codex. And there's also just trying to get the models to be more performant coders as well. And so OpenAI definitely tried to fast follow and probably has succeeded somewhat in a fast follow, but Anthropic really had the early momentum in that AI developing software when that exploded as a phenomenon. And I don't think that Anthropic has surrendered that lead. So I want to say that this is the better lesson, is leading OpenAI to misfocus, because they believed, like a lot of people around AI believe, that if you scale more resources, in this case, inference time reasoning, then that will make you competitive enough for any of the problems you might face. And I see Anthropic have invested a little bit more in the product dimension of Claude Code at exactly the right time, to capture an opportunity. So I'd say that is kind of like the second surprising learning for AI from 2025 is, even though scaling compute is going to, it's probably table stakes, there does need to be some product thinking, because opportunities come along, and to organize scaling compute is a slow effort, but repurposing your AI into a coding terminal is a fast effort, and that's why Anthropic won in that case. The third surprising learning for AI from 2025 for me, also kind of connected to the Claude Code thing, and I've been saying this for a while, and people are annoyed at me saying this all the time. The most successful UXs for AI are minimal translations of existing UXs. To the point that if you're spending a lot of time developing bespoke UX for AI, you might be misspending time. That's what it would look like to me as of right now. That isn't to say it will always look like that. But existing UXs, terminals, IDEs, and maybe software wizards. If I was going to say what the three breakout AI products are of 2025, one of them is a terminal with an LLM agent crammed in there. Two of them are IDEs with an LLM agent crammed in there, and they don't have a lot else like that on the initial release versions. In versions since, I think like a sub learning of this learning is the first initial versions of these UXs are minimally extended UXs. They're minimally extended. Why are those making the impact that they're making? I think it's because they neatly address a problem that well before LLMs existed has been recognized as a problem of dialogue systems, AI being a kind of dialogue system, even if you have a UX in front of it, which is how do I get humans to know what the set of capabilities of the dialogue system is? How do I get humans to know what the set of capabilities of the AI is? Or how do I get humans to know what kinds of things they can say or what kinds of inputs are valid in this system? And we think of LLM-based AI as being this kind of extension of validity, right? Like the commands that I can put into a Unix terminal are pretty restricted. They're pretty exacting in the syntax that I can put in them, and I can put much more into an LLM, and it doesn't tend to complain that what I say is syntactically invalid. But all that has turned into in terms of UX that seems successful is we seem to be able to kind of like take these existing experiences, terminals and IDs, and extend them with LLMs without kind of reimagining the UX of it very much. And then once we've kind of done that, then there are follow-on innovations that the product owners of these different products will phase in once they realize the way that folks are using it. The concept of latent demand is kind of important here. Latent demand is the idea of if I got a product out in the world, the way in which somebody uses my product that I didn't exactly envision is super valuable for telling me what product intent, the user intent for my product is. And so like that only works if you have a first initial version of your product that's used by users. So the fact that Claude Code is just sitting in a terminal means that as people use that terminal, I can get all sorts of data and information on what their intent for their problems that they're trying to solve are. And I think that that's likely driven some level of innovation in Claude Code with things like subagents, with things like code review, etc., that Claude Code bakes into Claude Code. I can also tell you about Cursor, which is what I tend to use more actively these days. Cursor and Windsurf, again, minimal extensions to existing UXs. They're both forks of VS Code, if I'm not mistaken, with their particular capabilities bolted into it. And at first, if I'm not mistaken, I think Cursor was even initially just a plugin for VS Code. It has now turned into its own IDE that's a fork, and that IDE that's forked, it's kind of like moving up the chain of elegance as it gets more information, as the company gets more information about how folks want to use their product. Because now in Cursor, I think you can interact with AI-based LLMs at like one of three levels. I think the first level is kind of the autocomplete level. I think the second level is there's an interactive agent that you can give commands or data to, and it will go and directly edit files. That's the mode that I tend to use the most often. And then the third mode, which might be relatively recent as Cursor 2.0, is the kind of agent mode that kind of like lives at the level of PRs, pull requests. And you basically give an agent a task, it um, comes back with a pull request, and you either merge or reject their pull request. So I should say, like the initial successful UXs are minimal translations of existing UXs and from non-AI products, and then innovations in UX can happen after. But full-fledged innovation from scratch of UX around AI um, doesn't seem to be have taken hold very much. There are some, maybe you could counter argue this slightly, because maybe I'm being dismissive of something like Lovable. I did kind of have a call out for software wizards or canvases, and I think canvases are potentially useful, but the more canvases have the issue that I go and make a software canvas, and my software canvas is not like a uniform interface to somebody else's software canvas. Whereas Claude Code technically lives in a terminal. It can live in Mac OS terminal. It can live in um, it can live in 95,000 other terminals. It could live in Xterm. It could live in whatever. And so like the uniformity of the interface, I think, matters as part of this equation. The IDs, it's not an accident that all of the Vibecoding AI IDs seem to be forks of VS Code. The so Lovable might be a little bit of an exception. I've only used Lovable a little bit. I Replit I've only used a little bit, but I wouldn't even say as an exception to my statement, because Replit, as the name implies, is a repurpose of a REPL, read eval print loop. It's kind of leveraging the idea of a terminal, kind of leveraging some freeform UX editing, if I'm remembering correctly. Um, but I also don't know if those are like the momentum products as much as the IDEs and Claude Code are. So I still think my position there is a sound one, which is that most successful UXs for AIs have to start with very, very, very familiar UX that's familiar to people without having AI in it. Fourth takeaway or learning that I had for AI from 2025. This one might also get me roasted on the internet. Open source modeling doesn't seem to have the robustness advantages of open source software. I have to call it open source modeling because the naming here is just horrible. I don't apologize for that term, because it's like there's no other good term. I can call it open weights modeling. That's fine. But the community tends to call it open source modeling, even though it's not open source. Say la vie. And you can't call it open AI because that's the name of a company that no longer does open AI. But I digress. But open source AI modeling doesn't seem to have the robustness advantages of open source software. And my case in point is um, the ecosystem seemed to be about as robust as like one player, which was Meta. And then Meta blundered Llama 4 and squandered all of their momentum. And this seems to have put a big, giant $300 billion company sized dent into United States based open source modeling. And it now seems like Chinese labs have the leader position in open weights open source software. So um, the one of the things that's often said about open source software and why it's robust is that many many eyeballs make bugs shallow. I think Linus Torvalds might have said that. I do not recall. But in any case, many eyeballs tend to make bugs shallow, easy to see. Um, Many hands make light work. Well, you only have so many AI labs that can pre-train a model from scratch. And so it's not like you have tens of thousands of open source developers. You have like four labs in the US, five labs in the US that can maybe do open source AI modeling, and the number seems to be shrinking, not growing. So there doesn't seem to be like real robustness of the ecosystem apart from the individual labs, and at that point, it's not really an ecosystem anymore. which is a shame because I was kind of really intrigued by the idea of the open source AI modeling ecosystem kind of becoming the main competitor to OpenAI. I thought that when we were entering 2025, that was probably like my prediction for what 2025 was going to be. And I couldn't have been more wrong on that one if I had tried. But I think that there's this, there was this kind of, I want to say robust, but vibrant, uh, open source AI development community. A lot of it seemingly centered on Hugging Face, and I don't exactly know what Hugging Face's valuation might be these days because it seemed to be the ecosystem for a lot of llama centered experimentation and development, and with llama cratering absolutely the I don't know if the Hugging Face ecosystem has taken a hit or not as a result of that, but it's my perception that they've maybe taken a little bit of a hit as a result of that. Um, I'm not, don't think that I'm like discounting Meta's position for building future compelling AI, but I don't think that they're going to follow on in the Llama approach or series. They may call the models Llama. It won't be under the Llama license. I'm almost certain of that. Or they'll release Llama models that are much less capable than their in-house models. I think they're gearing up with the Super Intelligence Lab for a big move away from open source. I think there's been some open reporting and even some quotage from Meta executives on that. So um, again, I think it's kind of a shame. I think like Llama 3 was kind of interesting because it looked like it could be a technical it could have a technical leadership position amongst modeling and give practitioners of modeling more tools at their disposal to work with than just being able to like call OpenAI APIs or call Anthropic APIs. And that's not completely gone away by any stretch of the imagination, but the US based part of it has certainly seemed to recede quite a bit as a result of Llama 4 being bungled. My fifth learning from 2026, or sorry, 2025, um, it's kind of a snide one, but I thought this was interesting, and it's got kind of two parts to it. But basically, it's interesting what kinds of innovations the labs will trade with each other. And I call this kind of like the deep seek moment. And this is the two parts of the deep seek moment. Because the first part is DeepSeek catapulted to the leader ranks of modeling with the verifiable rewards paradigm, which all of the Silicon Valley labs promptly adopted. The idea of verifiable rewards is that in a discipline like you're trying to model problems like in math or computer science, where you have a quantity, an answer that's verifiable automatically, even if you didn't. It's not supervised learning because you're not like here's the answer, here's the question, and I as an experimenter prearrange them in advance. It's a reinforcement learning paradigm where a process, a computation process, can do the verification. So, say like for a math problem, I can compute with a you know proof solver, theorem solver, that a given proof has validity, and so it's quote let's quote automatic or verify it's quote automatically verifiable, and you can use that as a reinforcement learning signal. It was one of the DeepSeek innovations. Likewise, for software engineering, the fact that my program compiles is a verifiable reward of some kind. It can be used to reinforcement learn against, and the labs have been doing so since DeepSeek came onto the scene with that work. But the other part of this that I think is kind of funny, and I might go on a digression here, is that DeepSeek also catapulted to the leader ranks with many innovations that I would call frugal innovations around transformer. They were trying to deal with the import-export restrictions from the United States to China on GPUs, and they're trying to be lighter on their GPUs than US-based labs are. And so they did a lot of tweaking in Transformer. It's specifically around the key value caches that are used. They did a lot of tweaking and very interesting experimentation to make their training time regimes, at least as stated in the technical paper, much less expensive um, than a fully GPU based US US based training would be. I think there's some ability to like question whether the values that they state in that technical report are entirely dependable, given that there seems to be a suspicion that's been verified through a few sources that they had access to GPUs that they don't mention in the paper, a class of GPUs, H100s, that they don't mention in the paper. So it does call into question a little bit if they were as as lean as they were possibly stating in the paper, because the paper seems to imply that their pre-training compute budget was about $6 million US, which is astonishingly low for that kind of thing. If they have H100s on the sides that are doing other things, it's a little bit of a different story. Another part of another part of discounting, or at least putting that $6 million figure into a better context, is they were also utilizing this. They were shown to be utilizing, I want to say, I'd have to go look. I think it was OpenAI, but they might have been utilizing OpenAI and Llama to come up with data for training the model. The DeepSeek training regime isn't like a straight isn't the typical pre-training run and instruction tuning run. They have a lot of interspliced regimes. They kind of alternate between these like supervised regimes and reinforcement learning regimes to try to make the RL stuff stable, I think. But in any case, the fact that they're using the data from other LLMs is kind of it's kind of another way of suborning computation into the problem that you're not fully accounting for in the $6 million figure. So that isn't to dispute it so much as to put it into the larger context. But in any case, I still think that they did very many innovations to make LLM training work with much lower resourcing, and it's kind of amusing and slightly strange to me that like the Silicon Valley lab seemingly has not utilized any of that. The Silicon Valley lab seems still be in the mode of just go get more GPU compute. Any time that you're spending on optimizing GPUs, we could instead be using to go procure GPUs, or maybe it'd be more accurate to say the time that we're using to optimize GPUs for training is time that we could better spend with similar engineers on optimizing like across the stack. So optimizing for training and inference. And as OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google all get drawn into an increasing variety of use cases, they've got to kind of think about how they specialize the inference time infrastructure quite a bit. It might be they might have security needs, they might have other kinds of needs, they might be computing at the edge, things, all manner of things that they think they need to optimize for, but they're not training time optimizations, it's inference time optimizations. So maybe the charitable thing to say with respect to the Silicon Valley lab position is they're spending their optimization budget on inference time, and that might be wise. I still find it kind of weird that they really haven't adopted many of the training techniques from DeepSeek, but I digress. The sixth takeaway from 2025 that I was semi surprised by, and it's a little bit late to press, so this is a little bit unformed, because of when the development happened. But pre-training might not be completely done. Pre-training might be a way that companies try to outdo each other, as shown by Google and Gemini 3.0. The it was really like the Gemini 3.0 was really like Google kind of showing that they're no longer this like slumbering, sleeping titan, that they can kind of marshal together all their formidable resources, including their data resources, and come up with something that's pretty hard to beat. And that might be as unassailable as a moat in AI as you can have, because OpenAI has neither the compute moat that Google has, because Google owns TPUs, and OpenAI doesn't own their own compute in that way. And OpenAI doesn't have the data advantage that Google has, because Google has mountains of data, text data, video data, etc., because of what they've been doing for 25, 30 years. And they've probably not let a lot of it go fallow. OpenAI has a much smaller data set that it can marshal, based mostly on Common Crawl and some other sources that they may have and may be subject to certain legal disputes. And but a lot of it is kind of like based on like the Common Crawl and publicly available internet data set. So I think like Google is showing like we can get more mileage out of pre-training because we have the most formidable data moat in the world. The other company that should kind of come as no surprise that also has a pretty considerable data moat, and then there's a question of whether they'll utilize that data moat effectively, is Meta, Facebook. They have mountains of Facebook. They have mountains of data from 20 years of Facebook. So, and there is again this Facebook. Meta has assembled the Superintelligence Lab, so they're probably like right now trying to put together a new highly scaled pre-training regime to try to come up with a new LLM, and or a new model of some sort, because it could easily be multimodal by nature. In order to build these kind of highly scaled competitive pre-trained models, you need you need tons of data. You need four things in my imagination. You need tons of data. You need tons of compute. You need tons of data. You need tons of compute. You need kind of like the knowledge or recipes of how to do it, and you also need a purpose to do it. That sounds kind of strange to say it that way, but I'll explain more in a minute. Google has all four of those, because Google, they have mountains of data. They might have more diverse open web data than any. They might have more diverse data than any other company on the planet. I emphasize the diverse because like there are other companies that might have more actual data, but like in a more focused domain. But Google probably has more variation in their data to make them the effective leader in varied data in the planet. Google has the data. Google has the compute because they own TPUs and invested in it many years ago. Google has the knowledge of how to do it. People have often talked about how Transformer was born at Google, but Google always had like the level of knowledge that they needed to be able to do something like this if they could marshal the will to do so and marshal the resources to do so. It did take a little bit of kind of shuffling together organizations and people at Google. And again, in any of these things that impact people, I'm not making light of people whose jobs were lost because of this, but Google definitely had to do some reorganization in order to make themselves competitive in this way, and they did it. And Google has the need to do it because they have, if you game out like, let's say OpenAI, if OpenAI got 100% of the search market, the people asking questions and looking for things market, obviously that's all of that's all of Google search revenue that it just cannibalized. But it's not all of, for example, Amazon's market. So Amazon might have some of those ingredients, but it doesn't have the need to go build a model like this because it doesn't have to go protect search, but Google does. So Google had an existential need to do it. It had to protect search. It does have one. There's a double-edged sword to that though, because Google has to protect search, and they have to kind of like disrupt themselves a little bit, but they can't disrupt themselves completely because they haven't stood up. There are facts in the revenue model. There are aspects of the revenue model for search that Google has that aren't completely replicated in the AI stack. Here's they still have not, as far as I'm aware or anybody's aware, they have not figured out a way to stack ads into AIs, into LLMs. Um, they've not figured out how to do various kinds of attribution. You know, part of being able to do advertising is to be able to tell users, we got you this number of views and this is what you owe us as we advertised for you and we provide you value. So there are parts of that revenue stack that have yet to be figured out by Google. So Google can't completely disrupt themselves, but they have all the elements to build a highly scaled pre-trained model from scratch. They probably also, all those same elements mean that they probably have more scale that they can add in all the other dimensions as well. They probably have more scale to do reinforcement learning based training. They probably have more scale to do different kinds of instruction tuning, so forth, so on. You look beyond Google and Meta, and I think the Meta thing is interesting because they have the data, they have the compute for now. An interesting thing that tends to happen in Meta earnings calls is that anytime Mark Zuckerberg talks about CapEx expenditures, the stock takes like a 3 to 5% hit. So they have the compute for now, but that is not to say they will always have the compute. You could imagine an economic downturn that gets investors kind of wary of Meta spending more compute, and it's hard to kind of it's they activist investors can't really directly threaten Meta and Mark Zuckerberg because he has a super majority of voting shares, but they can still act on the stock price, and so the investors may get a little bit, or the shareholders may get more anxiety with the scale of Meta's AI efforts and may start to retract a little bit. But they have the compute for now. They have the knowledge to do it because they just spent billions of dollars to go acquire the Avengers of building LLMs from all the other labs together into the superintelligence lab. And then in terms of like, do they have the need to do it? Well, Mark Zuckerberg seems to say they have the need to do it. They probably have to. Their game in this. If you think back to like when Llama 3 was coming out, a thing that was often said that I was always a little bit suspicious of was that Meta's being clever by commoditizing their compliments. That phrase was thrown around a lot, and what it meant was that they if their complement is AI that answers questions on demand that potentially takes traffic out of the social network, then Meta can win or at least protect themselves by commoditizing AI. And so like the open source dimension of Llama was part of that. But they now seem to have abandoned the open source dimension and have just gone into building the Justice League of AI researchers at Meta, and they seem to want to go do something with it. I'm not really sure that it's super helpful for user acquisition or even retention to add AI experiences into social networks, but if they think that doing this helps kind of stave off the demise of social networks as a market segment and helps keep them afloat for longer before they figure out what their real pivot is, it's justifiable from that dimension and business logic, I suppose. Apart from those players, I don't know that many other players could really do anything to get more scale out of pre-training. OpenAI and Anthropic don't own the data that they can go do it, and modulo some breakthrough on pre-training, um, which they could come up with maybe. It doesn't seem like the place they're going to try to compete. It seems like Anthropic wants to try to compete more on the product engineering question or engineering dimension and try to make themselves the AI provider that's dependable as a partner for enterprise. And that's the direction they seem to be going. OpenAI seems to be trying to go the consumer dimension direction. Um, and they seem to be trying to leverage post pre-training techniques to be able to specialize themselves there. So Google may end up being the main beneficiary of this for right now. They are the main beneficiary of this for right now. Meta might be at some point. They might surprise us with a breakthrough result in like April or May of next year. This year, 2026. It's 2026 now. They may come out with a breakthrough result in April or May because they've been cooking it since July of last year, and probably takes about 9 months to train up the model that they want to train up. It might be later. Who knows? And then apart from that, it's hard to see anybody else like making hay with pre-training. The one thing I was kind of musing over was, and this kind of goes to my predictions video where I said at OpenAI might make a very big acquisition type move to shore up their consumer position, and it would kind of feed into this. Is I mentioned that Amazon. I mentioned Amazon and the like who can pre-train a model, and Amazon has the data. I think they have like a good, not great cross section of data on their platforms that on the platforms that they can probably use for this purpose, which would be the consumer facing ones. I don't know that they can like lay claim to any data that sits in their compute environments for use in this. Maybe they can. I have no idea. Um, but in any case, like they have a good wealth of consumer data. They um, probably have enough probably have enough of that data to go help pre-train a model. They have the compute, obviously, to do it. Um, they uh, they still have like a pretty formidable science team, but I don't know that they have the specific knowledge to like go pre-train a model from scratch. But they could probably go get that if they needed it, if they decided they needed it. I don't think that they see themselves primarily though as needing to compete on the model space. But the interesting thing that kind of occurred to me is Amazon and OpenAI. Um, OpenAI OpenAI desperately needs compute and data. Amazon has compute and data. OpenAI needs a leadership position on models. Amazon needs to stay relevant in the AI world and figure out how to disrupt themselves on e-commerce. And getting capabilities that only Amazon has around AI would be very powerful. And I could see them doing some kind of trade of, it'd be complicated, but I could see them doing some kind of trade where OpenAI gets better access to compute from Amazon AWS. I don't know that they can't send data in the clear, but like maybe they have some, I'm speculating here, obviously, but maybe they have some training regime that runs on Amazon compute, and then they can forklift parts of that regime, outputs of that regime into an OpenAI model. You can imagine it being kind of like, um, sorry, blanking on the name of that technique. Um, LoRa. You could imagine a kind of LoRa-like scenario where there's a LoRa that's trained up entirely in the Amazon compute on the Amazon data, but then they get to play with that in their OpenAI powered models in some way. I could see something like that. Um, and Amazon either did recently or is about to throw an investment round into OpenAI, so it's not out of the realm of possibility. I think it would be a tricky deal to kind of bring together, but stranger things have happened. Um, so yeah, I think like the sixth lesson I learned from learning I learned from 2025 is that pre-training might not be done, but it might be the competitive advantage of the data rich and compute rich players like Google and Meta, and the data and compute non-rich players like OpenAI and Anthropic might have to compete on other grounds or might have to get creative to try to mitigate those advantages. We shall see. Um, yeah, I really enjoyed putting this video together. I think it was a good way of kind of clarifying what I took away from 2025 as a practitioner and watcher in this space. And I'm sure that when I make this again in 365 days' time, there's going to be 5 to 6 other things that are just going to completely missed them in advance because you can't foresee very much of this. And I think that that's why this is such a fun field to participate in. It's innovations come from all sorts of angles and very unforeseeable ways. And I think that that makes for a lot of fun. Yeah, so with that, if you liked this, like and subscribe to the channel. I could use all the likers and subscribers I can get. And thank you so much for your support and hanging with me this whole hour as I went through what I learned about AI from 2025. Be well, everybody. Bye for now.